Hello students, today we are going to learn on the topic of the spinal cord and spinal nerve. This is the item number 9 of the central nervous system and eyeball card. So let's begin. The extension of the spinal cord is from the foramen magna of the skull, that is, of cervical 1 up to the lower border of the lumbar 1 vertebra. The length of the spinal cord in case of male it is 45 cm, in case of female it is 42 cm. Now what are the spinal meninges? The spinal cord is surrounded by three spinal meninges. They are dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. What is the phylum terminally? It is the prolongation of the pia mater from conus medullaris to the back of the coccyx. What is cauda equina? Cauda means tail and equina means horse. From the caudal part of the spinal cord, it takes more or less a vertical course and form a bunch of spinal nerves around the phylum terminally. This thing is called the cauda equina. It is composed of the following nerve roots: the lower four pairs of the lumbar nerve roots, the five pair of the sacral nerve roots, and one pair of the coccygeal nerve. Now, let us discuss how the spinal cord is kept in position. Above, there is continuity with medulla oblongata. Below, there is fixation with the phylum terminale and cauda equina. And laterally, there is teeth of the ligamentum denticulata. Now, what are the positional changes of the spinal cord? In third month of the intrauterine life, it extends to the entire length of the vertebral column. Vertebral column grows faster than spinal cord. Terminal end of the spinal cord gradually shifts to a higher level. At birth, it ends at the lower border of lumbar 3, while in adult, it ends at the lower border of the lumbar 1. Now, what are the spinal segments? It is a part of the spinal cord to which a pair of spinal nerve is attached. Now, the spinal nerves emerge through their respective intervertebral foramina. If we discuss the vertebral leveling of the spinal segment, we can see in the in the region of the upper cervical, the spinal segment is cervical 2 and the vertebral level is also cervical 2. So the general rule is same. It's in the same level. In the lower cervical region, the spinal segments are cervical 6 and the vertebral levels are cervical 5. So the rule is one vertebra above. In the upper thoracic segment, if the spinal segment is thoracic 5, then the vertebral level is thoracic 3. So the rule is 2 vertebra above. In the lower thoracic region, the spinal segment is thoracic 10 and the vertebral level is thoracic 7. So the rule over here is 3 vertebra above. In lumbar region, it is lumbar 1 to lumbar 5 spinal segments, and the vertebral level is thoracic 10 to thoracic 11. It is the general rule over here is 3 to 5 vertebrae above. The sacral and coccygeal region, the spinal segments are sacral 1 to sacral 5 and coccyx 1. Here the vertebral level is thoracic 12 to lumbar 1. So the general rule over here is 6 to 10 vertebrae above. Now what are the features of the spinal cord? Spinal cord is divided into two symmetrical halves by the anterior median fissure and the posterior median fissure. The spinal cord provides attachment to 31 pair of the spinal nerve by anterior or motor roots and posterior or sensory root. Each root is attached to the cord by a series of rootlets. Each posterior nerve root possesses a posterior root ganglia. Now, what is the structure of the spinal cord? This is very important. The structure of the spinal cord is composed of the inner core and peripheral zone. In the inner core, it is called the gray matter, which is H-shaped. In the peripheral zone, it is white matter. Now, what is the gray matter of the spinal cord? In the cross section, the H-shaped pillar with anterior and posterior gray columns and horn is united by gray commissure, which contains the central canal. This area is called the gray matter. Now, the lateral gray column or horn presents in thoracic 1 to lumbar 2 to 3 and sacral 2 to 4 segments of the spinal cord. So, in thoracic 1 to lumbar 2 to 3 and sacral 2 to 4 segments of spinal cord, the lateral gray column or horn is present. So, there are three neurons over here, which is the motor neuron, sensory neuron, and interneurons. The motor neuron is present in the anterior and lateral horn, and they are alpha motor neuron and gamma motor neuron. The alpha neuron are extraphyseal muscle fibers, and the gamma motor neuron are present in the interphyseal muscle fibers. What are the sensory neuron? They are present in the posterior horn. Okay, so the motor neurons are present in the anterior and lateral horn, and the sensory neurons are present in the posterior horn. The interneuron, they are the small neurons which are present throughout the gray matter of the spinal cord. Now let's discuss the nerve cell groups in the anterior gray column and in the posterior gray column, and also in other parts. Now the nerve cell groups in the anterior gray column are um, medial nerve cell groups, central nerve cell groups, and lateral nerve cell groups. The medial nerve cell groups is present in most segment of the spinal cord, and it innervates the axial musculature of the neck and trunk. The central nerve cell groups is present in some in some cervical, phrenic, and accessory nerve cell. It is also present in the lumbosacral nerve cells. The lateral nerve cell groups is present in cervical and lumbosacral segments, and it supplies the limb musculatures. Now the nerve cell groups in the posterior gray column. From the apex to base, they are substantia genitalosa, nerve cell proprius, nerve cell dorsalis, and visceral afferent nerve cell. So substantia genitalosa is situated at the apex of posterior gray column throughout the cord, and it receives afferent fibers concerned with pain, temperature, and touch. The nerve cell proprius is situated throughout the spinal cord, and it receives afferent fibers concerned with senses of position and movement, and also two-point discrimination and vibration. The nerve cell dorsalis, which is also known as Clark's column, it extends from cervical 8 to lumbar 3 to 4 segments and is associated with proprioception. Now, the visceral afferent nerve cell is situated in the lateral to the nerve cell dorsalis, and it extends from thoracic 1 to lumbar 3 segments, and it is associated with visceral afferent information. Now the nerve cell groups in the lateral column, it extends from the thoracic 1 to lumbar 2 to 3 segments, and it gives rise to preganglionic sympathetic fibers. This nerve cell groups is also found in sacral 2 to sacral 4 segments, and it gives rise to preganglionic parasympathetic fibers. Now, what is the central canal of the spinal cord? It is present in the center of the gray commissure of the spinal cord. Above, it is continuous with the central canal of the caudal half of the medulla oblongata. Below, it expands and forms terminal ventricle in conus medullaris, and it ultimately terminates within the root of the phylum terminally. It is filled with CSF, and it is lined by ependyma. What is the white matter of the spinal cord? Each half of the spinal cord is divided into the anterior, posterior, and lateral white columns, or funiculi. So this division is occurred by the anterolateral and posterolateral sulci. So we can say that each half of the spinal cord is divided into anterior white column, posterior white column, and lateral white column by anterolateral and posterolateral sulci of the brain. The anterior white column is gives a motor sensation. The posterior white column gives sensory sensation, and the lateral white column gives mixed sensation. The anterior white columns are joined with the white commissure. Each white column is made up of the tracts. Okay, now what is the tract? This is very important. The tract is a collection of nerve fibers within the central nervous system which have the same origin, course, and termination. Let's discuss the ascending and descending tract of the spinal cord. The ascending tracts of the spinal cord conducts impulse from outside or inside of the body to the brain through the spinal cord. The ascending tracts are anterior spinothalamic tract, lateral spinothalamic tract, fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus, anterior spinocerebellar tract, posterior spinocerebellar tract. There are some other tracts like spinotectal tract, spinal-reticular tract, and spino-olivary. The anterior spinothalamic tract gives sensation to fluid touch and pressure, whereas the lateral spinothalamic tract gives sensation to pain and temperature. The fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus, it gives sensation of fine touch, two-point discrimination, and conscious proprioception. The anterior and posterior spinocerebellar tract gives sensation of unconscious proprioception and muscular coordination. Now, what is the anatomical organization? The ascending pathway to consciousness consists of three nerves. They are the first order neuron, the second order neuron, and the third order neuron. The first order neuron is posterior or dorsal root ganglia of the spinal nerve. The second order neuron is the spinal cord and gives rise to axons that cross the opposite side and ascend to a higher level of the central nervous system. The third order neurons are usually thalamus and gives rise to projection fibers to cerebral cortex. Now let's discuss the descending tracts of the spinal cord. It conducts impulse from brain to spinal cord. For example, the lateral and anterior corticospinal tract, rugospinal tract, olivospinal tract, tectospinal tract, vestibulospinal tract, reticulospinal tract, etc. What is the anatomical organization? The descending pathway consists of three neurons. They are the first order neuron, second order neuron, and the third order neuron. The first order neuron over here are cerebral cortex, and the third order neuron over here are the anterior gray column. Now, what is the intersegmental tract of spinal cord? The short ascending and descending tracts that originate and end within the spinal cord and exit in the anterior, lateral, and posterior columns are known as the intersegmental tract of spinal cord. Its function is to interconnect neurons of different segmental levels. What is the artery supply of the spinal cord? It is mainly supplied by the anterior spinal artery to posterior spinal artery and segmental artery. The anterior spinal artery supplies the anterior two-thirds of the spinal cord. The posterior spinal artery supplies the posterior one-third of the spinal cord. What are the anatomical position of the spinal cord? We can say this is the viscera of the spinal cord with meninges. Dorsal root ganglia lies posterior laterally. Anterior medial fissure lies anteriorly. Conus medullaris, phylum terminally, and chorda equina lies inferiorly. Thank you so much.